From a geological perspective, to bury the moai in 20 feet or more of sediment suggests that they are potentially thousands of years old, much older than traditional archaeologists have suggested.
For 500 years, the stone faces of Easter Island stared out in silence, and everyone who studied them walked away with a different answer.
Moais are incredible.
The moai is the first spot that people see.
Then scientists fed every measurement ever recorded into modern computer systems and asked one cold question. What did human researchers, looking at one statue at a time, keep missing for centuries? The machines answered for the very first time, and what came back has quietly unsettled experts across the entire world. The discovery that rewrote everything. In the year 2024, a group of scientists working between Denmark, Switzerland, and France did something nobody had ever managed before. They recovered the genetic material of 15 ancient Rapa Nui people whose remains had been sitting in a Paris museum for over 100 years. They fed those fragile genomes into powerful computer models that can read the history of a population the way a doctor reads a heartbeat. And the result, published in the journal Nature, landed on the field like a wave. The models revealed a population that grew steadily and calmly from the 13th century all the way up to the moment Europeans finally arrived. Barbara Sousa da Mota, one of the lead researchers from the University of Lausanne, put it plainly when she said the genetic analysis directly contradicts the idea of any dramatic crash before contact. The famous self-destruction story, the one printed in textbooks and repeated in classrooms for years, was simply never written in the blood of the people who actually lived it. Then came the part that genuinely stunned the room. Hidden inside those same genomes was roughly 10% Native American ancestry. When the team used their models to date when that mixing happened, the answer landed somewhere between the years 1250 and 1430. That is centuries before any European sailor reached the Pacific. It means the Rapa Nui, or their close relatives, very likely met people from South America long before the so-called Age of Discovery had even begun. They were not a doomed and isolated tribe waiting to die in the middle of the ocean. They were survivors, navigators, and quite possibly some of the first human beings on Earth to cross that impossible stretch of sea and come back alive. And the moment the machines proved these people never destroyed themselves, the oldest mystery on the island grew even louder. The answer to how those giants traveled across the land had been hiding in plain sight, and it was far stranger than anyone had guessed. The statues that learned to walk. For generations, the Rapa Nui kept saying something that outside experts quietly ignored. They said the statues walked. Not that they were dragged, not that they were rolled on logs, but that they walked to their final places. Scientists treated this as a charming little myth, a poetic way of describing some clever trick that had been forgotten. Then two archaeologists decided to actually put it to the test. Carl Lipo of Binghamton University and Terry Hunt of the University of Arizona noticed something very odd about the statues that lay broken along the ancient roads leading out from the quarry. These road statues were not shaped like the ones standing proudly on the platforms. They had wide, rounded, D-shaped bases, and they leaned forward at an angle of 5 to 15 degrees. That forward tilt would be a serious flaw in a finished statue. But it is exactly what you would design if you wanted a multi-ton object to rock forward on its own edge. So they built one. In the year 2012, they made a faithful concrete copy weighing about 4.5 tons, wrapped ropes around it, and split a small team into 3 groups. With just 18 people pulling in a careful rhythm, the giant began to rock from side to side and step forward, the very same way a person shuffles a heavy fridge across a kitchen floor. That replica walked 100 meters in 40 minutes flat. The myth was never a myth at all. It was an instruction manual nobody had bothered to read. The newest reanalysis only made the case stronger. A study examining 962 statues found that more than half of them sit clustered within 2 kilometers of the quarry, scattered in exactly the pattern you would expect from objects that occasionally tipped over and broke during a long and difficult journey. The roads themselves were dished and concave, which cradled an upright statue and steadied its wobble. And the way the fallen ones lie, face down going downhill and on their backs going uphill, matches a walking giant far better than any rolling log ever could. But moving a giant is only half of the problem. Choosing exactly where each one would finally stand was a decision that hid a secret all of its own, and the real answer had nothing whatsoever to do with the stars. The real reason they stood where they stood. When researchers ran the location of every single platform through spatial modeling software, hunting for what really decided where the giants would stand, the strongest answer that emerged was almost embarrassingly human. It was fresh water. In a major study led by Robert DiNapoli and published in the year 2019, the team showed that the platforms cluster tightly around coastal seeps, the rare and precious spots where drinkable groundwater bubbles up near the shore. On an island with no rivers and barely a stream to its name, water was survival itself. The ancestors were never placed to watch the heavens. They were placed to guard the wells that kept everyone alive. That does not mean the Rapa Nui ignored the sky, and this is exactly where honesty matters far more than hype. A small handful of platforms really do show deliberate alignments. Ahu Akivi, sitting inland, is the famous exception, where 7 statues face the setting sun at the equinox, off true west by less than a single degree. Another inland platform marks the winter solstice with similar care. These cases are real, and they are clever. But the dramatic story that all of the statues form one giant precision instrument falls apart the very second you actually measure them. Most simply hug the coastline and gaze back at the village they were built to protect. The statues were never cold scientific tools pointing at distant stars. They were ancestors, set up to face their own living descendants, standing eternal watch over the one thing that kept those descendants breathing. Every village could look up and see the faces of the people who came before them, turned toward home, guarding the water. Which brings us to something the old accounts almost always leave out completely. These were not blank gray heads staring into nothing. The builders did something to those faces that turned carved rock into a living presence, and when archaeologists finally uncovered what it was, hardened scientists described the feeling as being watched. What they pulled out of the sand had been deliberately hidden, and it had been hidden for a very good reason. The night. The statues opened their eyes. For most of modern history, everyone simply assumed the moai were finished as bare stone, those deep, hollow eye sockets left empty and shadowed forever. That assumption survived right up until the year 1978, when a restoration team was working at a platform called Ahu Nau Nau, sitting beside the only proper sandy beach on the whole of Rapa Nui. A Rapa Nui archaeologist named Sonia Hawa, working under the direction of Sergio Rapu, who would later go on to become the island's governor, began pulling fragments of white coral and a curved piece of red scoria out of the sand. When the team carefully fitted the pieces together, the shape was suddenly unmistakable. It was an eye, a real staring eye, roughly 35 centimeters long, carved from gleaming white coral with a red-rimmed pupil, shaped to slot perfectly into a moai's empty socket. In that single instant, the entire meaning of the statues shifted beneath everyone's feet. These were never meant to be blank guardians of dead stone. With their coral eyes set in place, the moai were believed to genuinely come alive. The Rapa Nui word for a completed statue captures it perfectly. They called it Aringa Ora, which means the living face. The eyes were said to release the statue's mana, its sacred power, allowing the ancestor trapped inside the stone to finally see and protect the people standing before it. And here is the detail that gives me chills every single time I think about it. The eyes were only ever inserted during ceremony, and they could be taken back out. This is almost certainly why the European sailors who arrived later never once described them. By then, the old religion had begun to fade. The eyes had been removed and lost, and the faces had gone dark and empty all over again. Those visitors met sleeping giants and never had the faintest idea that these statues had once been wide awake and watching. At its absolute peak, the island was something those latecomers never got to witness. Every platform held towering figures whose bright coral eyes seemed to follow the flickering firelight. And this was never a graveyard of cold idols, but a living congregation of beloved ancestors. And the builders were not even finished dressing them yet, because many of these statues wore something heavy and red upon their heads. That finishing touch was so awkward to lift that it created its own stubborn mystery, and solving it would point straight back to the strangest place on the entire island. The red crowns and the giant. In the pit, those heavy red shapes resting on the heads of so many statues are called pukao, and they were never merely decoration. They were carved from a soft red stone called scoria, dug out of a completely separate quarry called punapao, sitting on the opposite side of the island from where the statues themselves were born. Some of these crowns weigh as much as 12 tons. Hauling one of them across the island and then somehow lifting it onto a statue that already stood several meters tall sounds almost physically impossible. For years, that was treated as a genuine head-scratcher until Sean Hickson and Carla Lipo used three-dimensional scanning to study 50 of these crowns in fine detail. Their work, published in the year 2018, finally revealed the trick. The builders never lifted the crowns straight up at all. They rolled them up a ramp leaning against the standing statue using a rope method called parbuckling, where a loop of rope passed under the cylinder lets a small team control its roll from above. The faint carved ridges on the underside of each crown, ridges that would have been crushed flat if the stone had ever been dragged, proved the rope method beyond any doubt. Fewer than 15 people could crown a giant. Nearly every statue on Rapa Nui was cut from this single quarry, and standing inside it is unforgettable, because the work there was never actually finished. Hundreds of statues still lie locked into the living rock at every stage of creation, half-carved, lying on their backs, waiting forever for hands that simply never came back for them. One of them is the reason people fall completely silent at Rano Raraku. It is called Teti Tokanga, which means the giant, and it remains attached to the bedrock where it was being carved. If it had ever been freed and raised upright, it would have stood around 21 meters tall, more than twice the height of any statue ever erected anywhere, and it would have weighed well over 140 tons. Nobody knows for absolute certain why it was abandoned, although many of these quarry statues were quietly left behind because hidden cracks ran straight through the stone. But the heavy silence of that quarry hints at something far deeper than a few flawed statues. A whole living tradition stopped here. The hammers were set down upon the rock and never once picked back up again. And to understand why an entire civilization would walk away from its own life's work, we have to look closely at the one thing they left behind that we still, to this very day, cannot read. The code no human can read. The Rapa Nui did something that almost no other society on the face of the earth ever managed entirely on its own. They invented writing. On a scatter of wooden tablets, fewer than 30 of which survive anywhere in the world today, they carved row after careful row of tiny symbols, more than 400 different signs in total. Birds, fish, plants, and human figures, all locked together in lines that march in a strange back-and-forth pattern across the wood. And not one single person alive can read a sentence of it. This lost script is called Rongo Rongo, and the cruel reason it stayed silent for so long is genuinely heartbreaking. The only people who could ever read it were the priests and the chiefs, the educated elite of the island. In the year 1862, slave raiders from Peru carried off the island's leaders and keepers of knowledge, and the diseases that arrived afterward finished what the raids had started. Within just a few short years, every mind that held the key to the writing was gone, and the tablets became beautiful, unbreakable locks with no surviving key anywhere on Earth. For more than a century, brilliant minds have thrown themselves at this code and failed. But there is one small section carved onto a tablet known as Mamari that researchers genuinely believe they finally understand. It appears to be a lunar calendar, a careful record of the nights of the moon, even complete with a clever rule for adding an extra night to keep the count in step with the real sky overhead. So the single piece of this lost language we can almost read turns out to be a direct connection to the heavens, written by people who tracked the moon with extraordinary patience and care. Then, in the year 2024, a team led by Silvia Ferrara at the University of Bologna delivered a jolt that absolutely nobody saw coming. They radiocarbon dated the actual wood of several of these tablets. Most of them turned out to be fairly young, but one came from a tree that had been cut down between the years 1493 and 1509. That is roughly 200 years before any European is known to have set foot on the island. It strongly suggests the Rapa Nui created this writing entirely by themselves, with no outside influence at all, a staggering feat managed by only a tiny handful of cultures in all of recorded human history. So we now have ancestors who walked their giants across the land, coral eyes that brought solid stone to life, and a written language born in complete and total isolation. And yet this whole extraordinary world came within a single breath of vanishing from the earth forever. Brought down in the end, not by the islanders themselves at all, but by something terrible that arrived from across the sea. How a world almost vanished. For a very long time, the world told itself a comforting lie about how Easter Island fell. The story said the islanders did it entirely to themselves, that they were nothing more than a warning, a foolish people who chopped down their final tree and then starved in the ruins of their own greed. It made for a neat and satisfying morality tale. It also quietly blamed the victims for a crime they never actually committed, and the modern evidence has finally set that record straight for good. The truth is that the islanders survived, and even thrived, for centuries entirely on their own terms. What truly broke them came from the outside. In the year 1862, Peruvian ships arrived and dragged away around 1,500 people into slavery, including the priests, the chiefs, and the precious keepers of the island's knowledge. The few souls who were ever returned home carried smallpox and tuberculosis back with them, and those diseases tore through a population that had no defense whatsoever against them. By the census of 1877, the number of native Rapa Nui still alive on the island had collapsed to a mere 111 people. Of those, only 36 ever went on to have children of their own. Every single Rapa Nui person alive in the world today descends from those 36 survivors. A culture that once raised nearly 1,000 stone giants, invented its very own writing, and crossed an open ocean, was squeezed all the way down to a few dozen frightened people. And somehow, it still held on. That is not a story of failure. It is one of the most stubborn and beautiful acts of survival in all of human memory. When scientists handed the bones, the genomes, the platforms, and the silent tablets over to modern tools and asked them to finally speak, the machines did not just hand back a pile of new facts. They cleared the name of an entire people. They proved that the Rapa Nui were never a cautionary tale of self-destruction, but master builders, fearless navigators, and survivors who were wronged by the outside world and then blamed for it for generations. The statues had been telling the truth the whole time. We simply needed the right tools and a little humility to finally sit down and listen. So, which version of this story did you grow up believing? And did anything here change the way you look at those silent stone faces? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below.